Well, hey everyone, welcome to Zimperium's latest webinar. We are kicking off our Mobile Menace series with the most wanted mobile menaces. And today is number 7, risky apps. So we're going to talk about risky apps and what they mean to your devices, your users, and your enterprise. So this is Scott King, and thanks again for joining. Have the privilege to have Ken Lloyd, who is VP of Risk over here at Zimperium, and Ken looks at apps and researches apps on how to, make sure that they are not causing us harm in our enterprises. Is that right, Ken?
Oh, I'm sorry, I was muted. Yes, that is correct. Thank you. Sorry, I dropped my connection.
No, that's no problem. And Ken joins us from a recent acquisition, MI3. Ken, why don't you give us a little bit of background on the evolution of iOS and Android apps and what you guys do with the technology that's newly acquired by Zimperium?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So iOS and Android apps, as it comes to risk, is a little different than threats, if you will. So MI3's core technology is based on identifying risk conditions present inside a code, during the development process. It's based on identifying risk conditions external to the app, such as SSL connections and other external things, as well as, conditions where information can be shared with other apps on the device.
Yeah, it's really important. What you said is external conditions, right? Because, what you don't know, right? And what we're going to do later is we're going to go into some of the reports that the technology does produce. And, we're going to dive into detail on a couple of really risky apps, right, Ken?
That is absolutely correct.
All right. And then just kind of an overview of the series here. You can see 1 through 7. Exploits and profiles and phishing and apps. And today what we're going to do is we're really going to talk about the risky app, right? And there's a difference between a risky app and a malicious app. And really these are introduced to us by our users, right? So basically the devices themselves are consumer devices, and we use them for the enterprise, and therefore we have some management technologies. We've got some endpoint detection technologies, but the users bring the apps in from the outside world. So, we really want to be cognizant to not, one, slow down business or slow down productivity, by detriment to the enterprise. So we want to make sure and enable the users to perform their jobs, have a little bit of private lifestyle on their devices, right, with your games and your travel apps and things like that, and want to make sure that data isn't leaking out from under them, right? So risk is really in the eyes of the beholder, right? And what Ken talked about earlier is there's a difference between risks and threats, right? So what are risky apps? So a malicious app, Ken, is born to be bad, right? So this is some app that's been put out in the marketplace, and they're looking to steal, right? What are some of the things that you guys have identified throughout the years of an app that's really born to be bad?
So, typically an app that's born to be bad will obviously come with a threat name, meaning it's intentionally targeting a specific enterprise, a specific app, or a specific set of users, for an opportunity to grab data, privacy information, or to penetrate the enterprise or organization through an application.
Okay, that sounds pretty scary stuff, right? And then a risky app can be turned bad, right? So risky apps have privacy risks and inherent security risks because they're trying to steal data. How do you guys delineate malicious app versus risky app? And then we'll kind of move on, and we'll see the reports later. But what's the difference?
A great question. So a risk can be loosely defined as a set of conditions that exist for a threat to occur. So we look for opportunities that can be leveraged, if you will, for an attacker, for someone who's looking to gather additional information. So the important thing to understand with risk is it's personal for every organization. A government entity would likely view risk very differently than a gaming company or differently than a medical facility. So it's important to understand that while we'll provide all the risk information to potential areas of concern, they may or may not apply it to your organization. So it's important to look at those conditions and determine, what is relevant and what isn't.
Yeah, and that's important to know, right? Because like you said, each organization will kind of measure and react differently. But if you don't have the data on these apps inside of your enterprise and amongst your user base, then you're just using blind faith, right? You can't really make a determination on a 1 or a 0 or if it's good or bad, right? So, I mean, some of the privacy risks that we look at is on both Android and iOS it's a laundry list of here, but are some of these items more or less dangerous, Ken? It's a ability to read or modify clipboard data and sending messages and data over HTTP versus HTTPS endpoints. Are some of these worse, or should we be concerned about all of these more or less, or kind of what's your opinion on these lists?
Well, again, it depends on the organization, but ultimately the highest concentration of concern we see is around the endpoint communications. When we talk about iOS apps, we know Apple's got a pretty stringent control process when it comes to the coding practices. However, they don't necessarily have the same guidelines when it comes to privacy or data issues, because again, location in one app may be okay, but a location in another app may not be. So it again depends on the organization. SSL is the biggest consideration. We have different vulnerabilities coming out like Freak and like Beast, and as soon as a vulnerability of an SSL connection is exposed, any app that connects to a vulnerable endpoint, could be targeted, if you will.
Right, and it's really the targeting that we're concerned about, right? So we're not really concerned about widespread fraud amongst an app that does apply, but as a company, we as Empyrean here to protect the enterprise. I mean, we're looking for that, those targeted attacks and where they're using mobile devices as a step in a persistent threat or a persistent attack, right? It's not the end all be all. It's just one step to gather data on, like you said, geolocation and really connecting to to endpoints that are not appropriate.
That is correct. I mean, when it comes to a risky app, one of the concerns is leaking employee data. If you have, again, a government organization in a secure facility, you don't necessarily want to leak your step-by-step location history as soon as you get back, out into the real world, outside of that protected network.
Yeah, that is, I've seen stories. There's different news outlets that have actually done that and tracked people, in and around Washington, D.C., where you take a look at where these people go, the timing, and really to create a user pattern, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking Mission Impossible type stuff, but just to use that type of data against an organization is completely viable if you're not looking out for yourself.
Correct. And then one of the other considerations are, a lot of the developers will add third-party code or libraries that either contain vulnerabilities or usually contain data privacy issues and track the user across multiple apps. If they install a library that does user behavior, and that library is installed on 3 or 4 apps, there's a good chance that they can correlate that information in the background and build a profile of that user.
That's pretty scary stuff. So really, what are the goals here for these apps? If what do we need to protect ourselves against, Ken? It says credentials, data, and weaponization. How viable are each of these threats from an app perspective?
Well, typically we see issues with credentials being either embedded in the application. So for instance, during development, an enterprise that creates applications may put in their debug credentials or their testing credentials that are exposed. Credentials being sent from the user login to other external endpoints can be intercepted if there's SSL weaknesses or they're not using SSL at all. And then finally, data is the big one. You know, if you have an application writing activity to a log file that's accessible by any app or anyone, you have no control over what that app is writing, and it could be sensitive data. And the weaponization is obviously a concern, typically targeted and pinpointed and buried, if you will, inside of an application. They can be identified through additional apps that are downloaded after install.
Wow, that's I mean, that's pretty scary stuff, right? Especially the weaponization, right? If I'm looking for any combination of this, if I weaponize a device, you know, I can get all types of data, right? Because I'm brought in from outside, and once I'm inside, you know, with my device, it's almost, you know, like unfortunately the cliche of the Trojan horse here. You're basically enabling your users to bring in Trojans like that, and stealing credentials is actually pretty simple, right? I mean, you can grab your keychain data and use that against your users, and then, you know, that's, you're just kind of moving on down the line to you know, to really grab data for whatever purposes, right? You know, theft or fraud or insider trading or what have you. So how does Imperium help against, you know, fight against the risky app, right? So what we're going to do is talk a little bit about how we fight against this in terms of interrogating the apps and taking a look at the research that is provided back to the security professionals that are taking a look at this. But at its core is really the Z9 technology. So Z9 is the Imperium technology that it really looks at the behavior of all these items, and it's looking for patterns, right? So any machine learning technology that can read a lot of data, can formulate patterns, and then, you know, identify the device attacks, the network attacks, the malicious apps. And we're going to go into that in just a second. But how do you get that technology on your device? The technology is deposited in a couple of different methods. On the left, you can install Zips. So Zips is our mobile threat defense app. You install it on your devices, and then it basically can take a look at the behavior of the operating system, right, in a very private manner. We're not reading user data. We don't know who the users are, but we know whether or not your device is being attacked with an exploit over the network or via one of these apps we're going to take a look at later. And then there's Z-App. If you have a population of unmanaged devices, or you provide an app to consumers, right, you can put the Z9 technology inside your own app. For instance, if I'm a bank, I've got a mobile banking app, right? Because that's popular. I can take the SDK, drop it in, and it's as simple as an app update. And then basically my users are, you know, one, I'm protected against my users because the devices are unmanaged. And then you're looking out for fraud and things like that, and, you know, any kind of spying on your user base. So how does it really work? So since we are really tailored for the enterprise, right, you got to get the technology on the endpoints. You can deploy the management console on any cloud, AWS, Azure, Oracle, Google. You can then connect that to any number of MDMs or UEM packages that you may have, right, to make the management easy. And then the forensics can be deposited in any number of SIMs you may have. So if you have an incident response process, right, you obviously do, but you really don't have one for mobile. We basically just plug right in and just say, okay, hey, don't change any of your processes, but here's the data on all our mobile users. So pretty simple. So I think with that, Ken, we're going to drive into the console here. If I can do this correctly. So what we're going to take a look at is what we call Z3A, right? So Z3A is advanced app analysis, and this is where you're going to take a look at, interrogate all the apps in your environment. You can see on the right-hand side, there's a list of apps. You can look at privacy risk, security risk, the app name, what build it is and whatnot. What other type of information is provided, Ken, with by doing this app scanning?
So not only are the privacy and the security risks provided both in a scoring fashion, but they break them down into categories so you can quickly say, give me all the information that are data leakage orientated, or give me all the information on known vulnerabilities. Furthermore, in the reports themselves, we provide actual links to the classes, the methods, or the APIs that are causing that risk condition to exist.
Okay, perfect. So let me pause here. And I'm looking for my dashboard here. Okay. So here I'm logged into the main Zimperium dashboard, and we're going to go take a look at some of the apps, right? So over here you can look at OS risk if you're interested in that, and to see what type of OS your devices are using, give you a little detail on whether or not that is a good or bad idea. And then we can take a look at really all the apps, right? So let's take a look at one, the privacy risk, Ken, and the security risk, and I think I've got a report here. Let's see, Ken, we want to take a look at the Wi-Fi detective, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is an app that one of our users has on his or her device, and tell us, Ken, if this is a good or bad idea to have this app.
I certainly don't think so for an enterprise. That being said, this is an iOS application, and when we look at the privacy risk and the security risk values at the top right, you see there a score of 98 over 100. The higher the number, the higher the risk. Now, as we scroll down a little bit, you'll see we break them into a privacy section as well as a security section. And what I'd like to do, Scott, is jump to, I believe, just to not go through every item in here, but let's hit some of the more important ones. But I believe it's page 3. Okay. And give me a moment here. So one of the things here, 1, 2, 3, is we have that the app sends query parameters with private information such as password as well as user details. So when the user's logging in to the application, they are sending their information using get parameters. So website ? Username equals password equals. Obviously, the issue here is they can be intercepted, especially if they're not using an SSL connection. Furthermore, we see that this particular application is a Wi-Fi mapping application. However, it has access to your audio recorder functionality. So you kind of have to wonder or question, why a Wi-Fi mapping application is going to record your audio. Again, is your enterprise at risk? Now, looking a little further here, under the security summary, one of the concerns here is they've hard-coded what they call the NS URL, and that would be the page on the right, the second red icon after security summary, the authentication method, NS URL, authentication method server, trust. Basically what this is, it's the ability to accept any connection and override SSL and TSL chain validations. So if your endpoint has a misconfigured SSL certificate. It's expired. It has a vulnerability, or else it just fails the whole chain of trust testing. This application will still communicate with it and send that sensitive data to it. Now, right below that, we have a violation of the Apple policy, which is the app implements an over-the-air app installation. So this means after you install the application from iTunes, you're running it, it will download additional code and functionality. So that's a huge concern. What that means is that additional code and functionality does not get vetted by Apple. So there's huge exposure there, and ultimately, without a risk analysis, you're not aware of what's actually being pushed to the device.
Now, Ken, that sounds pretty interesting. If I have this app on my device, how and I wasn't scanning this for security or privacy risk, how would I know that, right? How would I know that this app is doing that?
You would not. Typically the application, while it may come up and give you a notice, needs to be updated or updating, you're still under the impression it's pulling it from iTunes or from an Apple vetted location, which is typically not the case. Again, this is against Apple policy.
Interesting. Anything else you want to take a look at in this?
Yeah, I do. Go ahead and move one page, if you will. And one of the things I want to bring up is on the left-hand side, the third item down. It says the app is configured to allow unsecured and unverified connections to server with lower TLS versions. This means that they can attack the SSL and do a cipher degradation on it in order to break that SSL connection. So that's pretty critical. So thank you, Scott.
Oh, interesting. Anything else before we move on to questions? If anybody has a question for Ken based on what we talked about earlier and how the app scanning works, or if you have a specific question on this report, or maybe we can actually provide this report. I don't know. We'll make that up as we go. But if there's any questions, please stop what you're doing and let us know how we can help you. But I have a question to begin, Ken. So my question is, how many of these apps do you think are out there, right? And what I'm really interested in is I got the app from iTunes, and then it actually calls for other code to be installed after I install it. Is this a common problem? Like, should enterprises really be worried about that type of thing?
Well, again, it's a risk situation. Whether it's common or not, I don't have that statistic in front of me. But the reality is Apple does do a pretty good job of identifying apps that sideload code. But developers can find ways to get.
Oh, and I think we lost Ken. All right, well, kicking it back to you, Allison. Do we have any
Apple
questions?
hasn't caught.
Oh, there he is. Sorry, Ken, we lost you because your connection is so bad. You must have a bad app on your phone.
Yeah, yeah. Ultimately, I don't have statistics on that particular risk, but it is a condition that either Apple is not enforcing or the developer has found a way to obfuscate or conceal during the vetting process.
Interesting. So just, I don't think you'd have any data on this, Ken, but how long do you think it would take a developer to be identified and caught for doing something like that? So if this is it's downloaded from iTunes, it's not a good app, it calls different code, or it has other security risks, what's the time frame, right? Because not everybody is scanning all of their apps. Only a few enterprises are. So is this a multi-month long process? Like how long could you hang out in the iTunes and keep doing that?
Well, it can be for a while. I mean, ultimately, things don't get addressed until they're brought to someone's attention. So if they stay under the radar long enough, it could go on for quite a while.
Interesting. Any other tidbits that you'd want to provide all the security teams out there listening?
Vet your apps. Vet them before they install them. And it's not even just the users, but pay attention to the apps that are being used for the executives, the third-party apps that are being provided by your vendors. And furthermore, if your organization creates applications, make sure you vet them as well during the development process on every build. So when your developers add those third-party libraries, when they connect to those endpoints, ensure that you're not exposing your enterprise code to additional risks.
Interesting. Well, thanks, Ken, so much for talking with me today about risky apps, Mobile Menace number 7. And everyone stay tuned for the rest of the series. And if you have a question that you don't want to ask on the air, you can send it to info@zimperium.com or go to our website and just fill out our Contact Us page, and we'll be right with you. So thanks, everyone, for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you.